Okay, I'll just kick off and then more people will hopefully join, or else we'll have a great discussion, intimate discussion. So my name is Hannah Phillips and I'm pleased to be hosting this session in the Economics for Girls series, which seeks to demystify and share ideas of economics. We had a great first series of sessions in February, and we've had another set of sessions this month. And this session is on the feminist green economy. And I'll briefly run through the structure of the session. So in the first half, we'll have an introduction to the feminist green economy with three fantastic speakers, and then time for a Q&A. Maeve Cohen will give an overview of what do we mean by feminist green economy. Alice Kukler will discuss how does a feminist green economy address inequality, and Anne Pettifor will explain what is a Green New Deal and the case for it. So then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A with those three panelists. And in the second half of the session will be a discussion on the feminist economy in policy making with Preet Gill MP. There will then be another opportunity for Q&A with Preet and all the other panelists. Please use the Q&A and chat functions that you can see below. And if you prefer to verbally ask your questions, I believe you can do that with the raise hand function. So let's start the first part of our session, which is the introduction to the feminist green economy. It's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our first speaker, Maeve Cohen. Maeve is a feminist campaigner and researcher for economic systems change. She's a program officer at the Social Guarantee and former director at Rethinking Economics. Over to you, Maeve.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's amazing to be here on such a prestigious panel. Yeah, and I'm a bit to be opening, but here we go. Yeah, so as Hannah said, she asked me to talk about what we mean by feminist green economy. So I'm going to give an overview of the theoretical underpinnings of the discipline. So it is going to be pretty theoretical, but I'm going to try and intersperse it with some examples and make it a bit more exciting. Yeah, so feminist green economy grew up as a discipline in opposition to mainstream economics. So it's impossible to define it without first critiquing. So I know that you're all familiar with economics, but very briefly, mainstream economics is based on a model of individual agents competing in markets to optimize either profits if they're firms or utility, whatever that means if they're people. So I'm going to break these concepts down one by one from a green feminist perspective. So firstly, individuals. So mainstream economics is based on an idea called methodological individualism, which is quite fun to say. So methodological individualism is the belief that everything that happens in society can be reduced to the interactions and understood by looking at the interactions of individual agents. So from a green feminist perspective, this is an issue because we see humans as embedded within the environment and within social relations. So to make that a bit clearer, there is no individual human being without light from the sun, without nutrition from food from the earth, without the society in which they were born and raised, or without the care and support that it took to form them. Okay, so when we try and isolate individual humans, it means that we're not able to properly account for or analyze the environment or the care and labor that they depend on. Okay, so these things, the environment and care, get left outside of the analysis. So we off the bat, we reject that, right? Also, from an intersectional feminist perspective, if we define human beings by their separateness, we inevitably create hierarchies and dichotomies such as man and woman, humans, and nature, white, non-white. And these aren't natural social categories as they're presented, but these are social constructs, and they are byproducts of this sort of patriarchal colonial worldview. So that's the issue with individuals. Competing in markets, the centrality of markets within mainstream economics is a big problem when we're thinking about the natural world and when we're thinking about reproductive and domestic labour, because it just leaves it all out. So basically, in mainstream economics, the market is the economy, and everything outside of the market is outside of the scope of analysis. And that gets us into this really weird place where, because economics is such a dominant and influential discipline, and because when we make policy decisions, we have to back them by economic reasoning, we end up living in a society which is serving the economy rather than an economy that's serving society, which is like obviously nuts. So we understand this to an extent when we're talking about the environment because of the work of environmentalists. We understand that when we consider the environment as outside of the economy or as an externality, as is the jargon, then it's just treated as a free resource. And we know that it absolutely is not free, right? Treating the environment as something that we can just continually extract from has led to the ecological crisis that we're now facing. But what is considered less is the fact that this same relationship is happening within social reproduction, within caring and domestic labour. So when we see this labour as a free resource that can just be continually drawn upon, this is causing like a parallel crisis in care. And to give you a sort of pertinent example of what I mean by this, if, for example, so we've got care as a collective good. So if, for example, there's a global pandemic and we shut down childcare, it's not that care no longer gets done. It's just that it's privatized and obscured from view. So all of the children that couldn't go to the childcare anymore were still being cared for. They were just being cared for by predominantly women in the home. And that caused massive problems, as we saw, and increased the burden on women. So another point is that this same relationship is occurring with regard to labour and resources in the global south. So obviously, historically, these have been seen as completely free, right? So we just extracted resources, the global north extracted resources from the global south for free. It also had free labour where it created slaves. So even if these things do have a price on them now, if they are part of the market, because of this historical relationship, the market price is incredibly low and not the same as the actual price. So basically, feminist green political economy says it's not good enough to get rid of just one type of extraction. It's not good enough to just stop extracting resources from nature. We need to stop this extraction from care, and we need to stop extracting from the global south. So the individuals are competing in markets to maximum profit. The profit one is pretty simple. Basically, that's what's at the core of this upside down relationship between the economy and society. So the whole way that everything is set up is to extract profit rather than to fulfill people's needs. And like profit extraction on its own doesn't need to be, profit on its own doesn't need to be a bad thing. But when it's just, that's the whole point of the economy, it is a really bad thing. So the vaccines is a really good example of this, right? We should just be vaccinating everyone. We should be giving vaccines to the global south because we're in a global pandemic, and we know that a way that we can stop this is by vaccinating people, but we're not doing it. We've got patents on vaccines and they're not free because we need to extract profit. And this is just a completely backwards way of viewing society. This is an example of society fueling the economy rather than the other way around. So finally, I've sort of pointed out some ways that green economists and feminists agree in what feminist green political economy is, but I really want to draw attention to a bit of a contentious issue within green and feminist political economy. So green economists or ecological economists say, and quite rightly so, that we really need to reduce consumption and production, and we really need to reduce the amount of harmful waste which is going into the environment. And this is absolutely true. But we really need to understand from a feminist perspective that a lot of the technologies that have led to women not being tied to the kitchen sink for their whole lives is that these technologies aren't very green. And a really good example of this would be nappies, right? So if we're going to get rid of single-use plastics, which is a good thing, that means we're going to get rid of disposable nappies, which is massively going to increase the amount of labour needed in childcare. And that doesn't need to be a bad thing. We can make opportunities out of this. We just need to think about who is doing that labour. So we need to make sure that when we get rid of single-use plastics, people aren't just boiling nappies on their hobs for hours every day. We can set up little industries around this. So we can set up green, sustainable laundries where people can come and collect your fouled nappies and do them for you in a green, collective way and bring them back to you, and not increase the amount of labour that's on the shoulders of women. Another really good example of this would be food. If we're all eating like locally grown organic food, it's a lot more labour intensive to create a meal out of that than it is to just bang some potato smileys in. So we really need to be thinking about what extra labour is produced when we go green, and who is doing that labour, and how we can ensure that that labour is distributed in a more equitable way, and in a way that doesn't just fall on the shoulders of women. And I always really like to say this quote from this eco-feminist called Mary Mellor, because I think it really sums all of this up. In the dreams of a coming of age in which one can hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and be a critic after dinner, there is never any mention of who cooks that dinner. And I think that that's basically what feminist green economy is all about, is thinking about, yes, when we're moving to this green sustainable world, who is cooking the dinner, and how can we make sure that that labour is equitably distributed? And that's me.
Great, thank you so much, May, for that really comprehensive introduction. I thought it was great. You talked about where this field came from, and importantly talked about some of the tensions. So that was really great to start us off. And we have our second speaker is Alice Kugler, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at University College London. She works on topics in labour economics, public economics, inequality, and innovation. And in August, she'll be joining the Central European University as an assistant professor in economics. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to speak on this panel. And thanks, May, for giving a really excellent overview of some of the issues involved of what we're thinking about today. I'll have a very labor economics focused view on the topic, but I want to think about what happens to inequality. First, when there is more green economy activity happening, and then also if we think about the feminist aspect in the green economy. So the green economy, I think, has been seen as an important step potentially to reduce inequalities. And inequalities are there in many dimensions. So you can think of global inequality, and that potentially being reduced through green economy activities. There's also inequality within countries, such as in terms of race or class, inequalities across regions, and these often intersect. And if a green economy creates well-paid jobs for low-income workers, some of these inequalities might be reduced. But that doesn't necessarily mean gender inequality will be reduced. So one way of thinking about the feminist green economy is to create well-paid jobs for women. That may not be intuitive, as often we think of the green economy as investment to decarbonize the economy, new ways of producing, new types of infrastructure. There is job creation, but often for jobs in male-dominated sectors, jobs for male workers. And so how can these activities be beneficial for women? One way could be to encourage young women or newly training women to join these types of jobs, these types of sectors, to retrain if they have other careers, and provide development programs or subsidies to join the green economy types of jobs. But as Maeve has mentioned, there is also the impact, the effect of investment in general, and a more holistic view of potentially investing in complementary sectors, in sectors where many women work, such as the care sector, for instance. And I'll provide a bit more detail how we can think about that. So first, let me just briefly touch upon the situation we are in at the moment. So for many years, for many decades, inequality has been on the rise. And if we think about inequality in terms of income, just to simplify, that was partly driven by a decline in employment in blue-collar jobs, in the manufacturing sector, decline of union coverage, and in general, there has been a decline of the wages of low-income workers. Partly, the green economy is seen as a chance to address these trends and reverse these trends in wages and employment. In terms of gender, however, and there are inequalities in precisely these dimensions in terms of income, in terms of employment, and also many other dimensions, for instance, cultural and political inequality. And partly, I think Maeve described very well that the underlying reason is that there is unpaid care work that is often carried out by women. And these tasks take time, they might not be remunerated, but they affect what type of labor market participation we see by women. So for instance, there's an employment gap between women and men that also affects the disposable income that women have. So fewer women work. If they work, they might more often work in part-time jobs than men. There is a wage gap that is often discussed, the gender wage gap, that women work less when they do work the same hours than men. Their wage is lower. Why is that? Potentially within the same job, they might earn less. Even if they have the same training, the same education, carry out the same task, that might be due to discrimination. But also, to a large extent, the gender wage gap comes from women doing different types of jobs and given less or different responsibilities when they work in these jobs. So there are fewer women in traditional blue-collar jobs such as manufacturing, construction, engineering. When women have college degrees, they tend to have fewer jobs in STEM fields such as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And the jobs have characteristics that mean they have to commute less, they do less hours potentially, or more flexible ones, compatible with family, compatible with these unpaid caring tasks. And there's a lot of evidence from research that these gender wage gaps increase markedly, for instance, when a child is born, because women take these tasks on. And so then the question really is, what role can a feminist green economy play to tackle these inequalities? So I think one major aspect is a green economy will not just come about. There will be public policies and regulations to be put in place. There will be significant public investment. And that's really an opportunity to think comprehensively about the policies. So there are various issues that need to be addressed, and we don't want to be too narrow, but take it as an opportunity to address more generally what we see happening. So one, as I said, we can ensure that women directly get these new green economy jobs. We can encourage training and education, equip with the required skills. And at the same time, I think it's important to provide institutions that facilitate participation in these types of jobs, such as affordable, high-quality childcare facilities, also promote more equality in these unpaid caring tasks, for instance, through more progressive parental leave policies. And also take this opportunity of investment and invest in these complementary sectors that employ high shares of women, to revalue these types of paid work in the care sector. That will raise the wages of women and reduce inequality between the genders. And there will be also a high payoff to society, because there might be a possible increased labor market participation of women. Children will benefit if they attend high quality childcare and education, especially if they come from low income backgrounds. And so I think this urgency of tackling the climate crisis will create investment, and we should really think carefully about how to invest and in what types of things to invest. Because otherwise there is this automatic effect. There will be new jobs created and revaluing of some sectors and tasks will happen. But in terms of the gender relations, that might reinforce some of the existing gender inequalities. So there is an importance of careful policy design to not just have these automatic effects play out, but really think what the effects might be. And I think even very good feminist green economy policies will not manage to have an equal pay across all sectors, across all genders. So there is always a very important role for a well-functioning tax and transfer system that then can use payoffs from such new activities in the green economy to then invest in a well-functioning society that has healthcare, education, and innovation accessible to all, and to reduce these persisting inequalities. So this is just my view from kind of a labor economics perspective. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Alice, for that overview of inequalities. And obviously the labour market perspective is very relevant to the Fabian Society and the labour movement, and that was a great follow on from Maeve's introduction. So thank you so much. And so we'll move on to our third speaker, is Anne Pettifor, a political economist, author and public speaker. She holds a variety of posts, including Director of Prime Policy Research and Macroeconomics, a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum, and chair of the advisory board of Goldsmiths College Political Economy Research Centre. She has written multiple books, including her latest, The Case for the New Green Deal, which was published in 2019. Thank you for joining us, Anne, and over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, and it's wonderful to be on such a great panel of great feminists, of wonderful women, and so thank you very much for including me in this. So Maeve and Alice have talked about the real world that women are in, and I want to talk about a world where women are largely absent and which appears very unreal in many ways, but which has an enormous impact on both women and the ecosystem, and which is something that is a field, an area that I would like to see feminized. I would like to see far more women feel confident in talking about it and getting grip with it, because it actually affects all of those policies that Maeve and Alice have been talking about. So what I'm talking about is the financial system, and I want to talk about it in relation to the Green New Deal. Now, the Green New Deal is modeled on Roosevelt's New Deal. And the reason we chose that as a model is that Roosevelt did several things in 1933, which were extraordinary, actually, at the time. He, A, tackled unemployment. B, he tackled a massive ecological crisis, which was called the Dust Bowl. But C, he tackled Wall Street, essentially. And he understood that in order to tackle unemployment and the Dust Bowl, he needed to transform Wall Street and the way it worked. And so when we drafted the Green New Deal, when a group of us came together in 2007-8, here in my flat in London, with Caroline Lucas and Colin Hines and Larry Elliott from The Guardian, we sat down and we wanted to make very clear that the ecological system, of course, is very closely integrated with the economic system. And therefore, to save the ecosystem, we have to transform the economic system. And that, from my perspective, means the financial system. So this is a field that women tend not to talk about. We tend to confine our discussions to taxation, which is a tangible thing which we all experience and have, and we all have to fill in tax forms. We know what they're about. The monetary system is the intangible system which actually determines outcomes for us. It determines whether or not women get jobs, what kind of jobs they get, what they get paid for, and whether or not those jobs are sustainable within the finite limits of the ecosystem. So I want, if I may, and I'm not sure that it is feminist economics, but it is heterodox economics. And I want to talk about it because I think women just do have to get engaged in this in a much deeper way. There are some wonderful women working in this field, including my friend Daniela Gabor, who's a professor in Bristol. And there are wonderful women, for example, on the Financial Times, Sarah O'Connor, who does the Labour policy, covers Labour policy. So there are some really good women, but there just aren't enough of us. This is a world that is dominated by the blokes, and they operated in their interests, and in particular in the interests of the 1%. So let me just begin by explaining why I think the financial system is important to the ecosystem and therefore to all of us. And it is this, which is that all economic activity originates, if you like, with money, and money originates as a social construct. It's nothing more. Money begins as nothing more than a promise to pay. And when you see a £10 note which says promise to pay on it, that £10 note is not the promise, but it's a symbol of the promise. It's symbolic of the promise that you're making, that you will pay for something. Mostly we don't have any symbols except for some digits, some numbers on our bank statements, because most of today what we do is walk into a coffee shop and wave a card at a machine, and miraculously, you know, £2.60 for a cappuccino is transferred from our bank, my bank, to someone else's bank. And money has always been that. It's always been that intangible thing, promise to pay. But therefore, it's a really powerful thing, because those promises have to be upheld. And how many promises are we making? And are those promises sustainable? When we say we promise we'll repay this £300 million that we're investing in some new North Sea oil project, can we honestly say that we will repay that? Can we say that it will be repayable? In my view, not. And what are the risks involved in that promise to pay? The problem with the promise to pay is that if it's not managed, if it's not regulated, if we don't decide whether or not it's correct to invest £300 million in exploiting a new source of oil in the North Sea, then we ought to have a policy and we ought to have a way of managing that money. But we don't. The decision to invest in the North Sea is taken by something called the invisible hand. So, an investor, someone who wants to invest in North Sea oil will go to the bank, and the bank will say, if you promise to pay me back in 10 years time or 15 years time, here's $300 million. And because I see you've got some collateral, and please sign this contract, and this is the rate of interest on the loan. Hey presto, $300 million appears and is invested in something which is really quite dangerous for the ecosystem and for society. So we need to understand the monetary system, because it's constructed, it's socially constructed, mainly by men, almost exclusively by men, and managed and run by men, mainly in the interests of men. So, for example, come the crisis of the pandemic, and we discovered, or at least should I say the Tories discovered, that in fact there is a magic money tree. And when, you know, we'd been told beforehand that no, there wasn't a magic money tree, and everyone said it was ridiculous to even suggest so, Rishi Sunak showed us that there is a magic money tree. So plenty of people who are in jobs and who pay taxes and who therefore are on HMRC's books managed to get furloughed, managed to get paid, right? A lot of people who are not on HMRC's books in a direct way, or who, you know, are in very precarious employment, many of them defined as key workers, didn't get paid. Now, in a way, that system was massively discriminatory against key workers. And we know that the bulk of key workers, in particular in the health sector, are women. And then when it comes to the question of how much they should be paid, that's determined also by men. And the argument then becomes, sorry, we don't have enough money for that. We've had enough money to find £23 billion for test and trace for some big corporations. There's enough money to bail out the whole of the City of London. There's enough money to nationalize Wall Street in the City of London, because that's what happened during the pandemic. But sorry, there's not enough money to pay the nurses. These are decisions taken at that high level by men, in the interests of men, and in particular in the interests of the 1%. So it's my view that we should be feminizing monetary policy and monetary theory. We should be understanding it. We should be curious about how it works, and we should be confident enough to go out there and challenge the men on the way in which the international and also the national monetary system operates in their interests. I mean, I can't go on now at length about the monetary system and monetary theory. I have to say I find it absolutely fascinating. I feel we should all understand it. And one of the reasons we need to understand it came up today in a discussion that I had on another podcast with some Greens. And that was to do with the fact that poor countries don't have monetary systems. If you go to Malawi, they have a currency, but it's very, very weak. Their central bank is has no credibility. They don't have a sound tax collection system. They don't have a sound legal system for enforcing contracts. As a result of not having these public institutions, they don't have a monetary system. And as a result of not having a monetary system, they have no money. Instead, they have to borrow money from richer countries in the form of dollars and somebody else's currency, not even their own currency. So they borrow dollars and sterling and Japanese yen and so on. And that gets him into enormous difficulties, because for a poor country to repay the loans on these hard currencies requires, the extraction of labor and of ecological assets on a scale which is just unacceptable. But there has been a very determined policy by Western economies to prevent poor countries from building up the infrastructure they need in order to have monetary autonomy, in order to be able to have their own money system. And if we remain ignorant of that, if we don't understand why it is that Malawi doesn't have money and cannot generate QE, for example, or South Africa cannot, then we need to understand that that's because they have, in a sense, been colonized. And if we don't fully understand that, we can't argue for a transformation of the system. So this is a plea to women to feminize monetary theory and monetary policy and not to be afraid of it. I honestly want to assure you that it is not rocket science. The boys would like us to think it's rocket science, but it isn't. And the more we understand it, the more we will be able to influence and manage the allocation of resources as we come to this transition to a green economy. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much, Anne, for that great intervention, and it was great to end with a plea to action, and that's exactly what this kind of series is about, trying to demystify and get Fabian women members to talk about economics. So thank you so much. Instead of having a kind of separate Q&A now, in the interest of time, I'm going to invite Preet to speak, and then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A with all the panelists. So to kick off her talk on feminist green economy policy making, I am very pleased to welcome Preet Gill MP. Preet is the Labour and Cooperative MP for Birmingham Edgbaston, becoming the first female Sikh MP in 2017. She is the Shadow International Development Secretary, having previously served as the Shadow Minister for International Development. She is also the chair of the Cooperative Party Parliamentary Group of MPs. Before joining Parliament, Preet was a social worker and served as a cabinet member for public health at Stanfield Council. Thank you, Preet, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and what a great session so far from three wonderful speakers. And I think, the wealth, depth and breadth of experience has been such an inspiration to me. As Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, my focus is usually on other countries, but as a constituency MP in Birmingham, I know that the problems and the challenges facing women and girls worldwide are far often too similar. And Labour under Keir have been clear that whilst most of us are probably all desperate to get back to some form of normality after a very, very difficult year, we cannot and we must not return to business as usual. And I want to give a bit of context about where the world is at the moment to explain why a feminist green economy isn't just a luxury to be discussed in sort of settings like this, but actually it's integral to tackling the global challenges facing us today and building a much fairer future for the people and our planet. Whether it's severe droughts and soaring wildfires to devastating flooding, over the last 20 years, climate-related disasters have affected 4 billion people, caused 500,000 deaths, and has displaced millions more. And we know that it is going to continue to do that. It's threatened the very existence of many island nation countries, and of course it's cost trillions of dollars. But even if every country on earth keeps to its current climate commitments, we will still be looking at over 2 degrees warming by 2050. And from Birmingham to Bangladesh, none of us are safe from the climate crisis, but time and time again, it's women and girls who bear the brunt. And as we all know, the inequality doesn't actually stop there. Globally, 120 million girls under the age of 20, that's about 1 in 10, have experienced sexual violence, with the actual figure likely to be much, much higher. And due in part to the pandemic, 47 million women are going to be pushed further into extreme poverty this year alone. And with 20 million girls on top of the 131 million already out of the school before this crisis actually began, are unlikely to ever return to school again. And meanwhile, globally, women do 3 to 10 times more unpaid care and domestic work than men. And while during the pandemic, yes, we've seen more men take part in domestic duties, the world is still 92 years away from achieving equality in unpaid care work between men and women. And there are a wide range of cultural, societal and legal reasons for this. But is it any wonder that women struggle when they not only have to do their own job, but also they are doing the unpaid work far more than their counterparts? I know that even in my immensely privileged position, what it's like to take on the bulk of domestic chores and caring responsibilities on top of everything else that I'm expected to do. And juggling the demands of lockdown has been a challenge, with the balancing act of representing, of course, my constituents, given how difficult things have been, but also focusing on my policy brief as the government took over the department and what's been described as institutional vandalism. And of course, 2 wonderful daughters, as you saw on the screen previously, interrupting Zoom calls, whether it's to ask for lunch or help with schoolwork or just wanting love and attention. And I know it isn't just me that has had to go through that. So many women talk about actually how much their workload has increased during the pandemic. But is it any wonder that women in positions of power and decision making are still held up as being something quite rare? Yet it should be something that should be the norm, especially because we have to compete with all these additional sort of barriers, and disproportionately we have been affected given that there's been a global pandemic. But take the global workforce as a topical example. 70% of that global workforce are women, and yet only 25% of health system leadership roles are held by women. And similar statistics are pretty much reflected across local and national governments. And this is not only intrinsically wrong, but it really limits our capacity to tackle the threats facing all of us. You know, far too often, especially across the global south, you see that it is, you know, women are the central pillars within their communities, and they're often the leaders in the face of adversity, and the people who we see generally step up and provide that drive and direction to really rebuild and recover. And the need for political, social and economic empowerment of women and girls is clear, but it's also clear that this government is actually moving in the other direction. They have failed to rise to the challenge of rebuilding our country and world in a way that tackles insecurities and inequalities we face. We only need to look at that in terms of the finances that they've made available for the green recovery. Germany is somewhere at 35 billion. France, again, very similar numbers. The UK, less than 5 billion. The G7 2 weeks ago was an opportunity really to change this, but the Prime Minister was content to just have his photo taken in the sun and play host rather than actually lead. And the recent cuts to the aid budgets are really the most visible sign of a lack of leadership, a perennial retreat from the world stage. I mean, 70% has been cut to this year's budget for the Tomorrow Cities project. This is an act of vandalism. They've wrecked the past 2 years of collaboration with scientists, with NGOs, with communities in informal settlements in places like Nairobi, in Kathmandu and Istanbul, which would help them prepare for future disasters like earthquakes, floods, landslides and fires. And they've also cut the budget to the UN Family Planning Agency by 85%. This would have helped prevent 250,000 maternal and child deaths, 14.6 million unintended pregnancies and 4.3 million unsafe abortions. And the very fact that the government have not undertaken any impact assessments just shows just how callous the aid cuts really have been, and they have cost lives. So what needs to change? Well, I think firstly, we have absolutely got to uphold the principle of leaving no one behind. And secondly, rather than treating the areas that all of us on this panel have spoken about in isolation, we've really got to address the root cause to secure any kind of long-term sustainable change. And we need a profound reorganization of the way that the global economy is structured, going beyond protecting our planet and limiting harm to women and girls towards a world where planet and people are able to flourish and thrive. And I actually want to see many, many more social movements that want to create change. And I want to see those voices that we can provide support to those voices, especially across the global south, who are in fear of speaking up at times. But a key pillar of the work that I've been doing in my team in respect of international development is working with the International Trade Union Congress, who are supporting, of course, its members and affiliates around the world, to not only consider the abstract motion of a just transition, but actually to do it and deliver it. And a just transition recognizes that really talking about climate crisis has got to be done in a way that seeks to reduce rather than increase inequalities. And that means rather than just tackling the climate crisis alone, we do it alongside shifts to affordable and clean energy, promoting decent work, greater job security, social protections, reducing poverty and inequalities, and all the other issues that I talked about that hold women back. And while women are better represented in the renewable energy sector compared to fossil fuels, occupying over a third of jobs, the gender pay gap remains large, and there is a lot of work still to do to tackle those structural and cultural barriers of participation. So we've got to grasp the opportunity to shift away from fossil fuels and resource-intensive industries. And we know that moving away from fossil fuels requires a lot of upskilling, as well as recognizing the need to build resilience in communities around the world. Because if we to focus solely on the current fossil fuel workforce, both directly and in the supply chain, which is predominantly male, then we will only simply reinforce and recreate those existing gendered divisions. And that's why I've been working very closely with Emily Thornberry and Luke Pollard to push for due diligence on supply chains to take account not only of the environmental impacts, but also on the impact on gender equality and human rights. And the EU, we've seen, is already actually moving in this direction with proposals for mandatory supply chain due diligence, because there were real concerns that a voluntary regime was actually insufficient in addressing the potential negative impacts of globalized business activities. But at the moment, only 1 in 3 businesses actually conducts appropriate due diligence measures with regards to its supply chain. So huge amounts of challenge there. But to better understand the challenges that we face, Labour's International Development Team have launched a consultation on how we can actually achieve gender equality around the world, with an understanding that we've got to engage, with views across the different characteristics, of course, but also race, class, and religion. And it is why we've also set up the International Climate Justice Network, because I think it's so important that we gain insight from those at the sharp end of the climate crisis who can inform the work that we are doing here. And of course in the multilateral system. But to achieve a just transition on the way to a feminist green economy, we must transform and overturn the deep-rooted structured gender inequality which pervades societies the world over. And that is why we need to move beyond notions of charity, but towards one of solidarity. And from pandemics to extreme poverty, inequality, and the climate emergency, we can't tackle any of these challenges alone. And we really need to focus on developing those partnerships between people and communities, if we're going to address some of the challenges that affect us all. But building on the solidarity we've seen from people across the country during the pandemic, I believe this is absolutely possible. So together, I think we can do it. And I really look forward to working with you all to make this a reality. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Preet, and thank you so much to our amazing panel. That was very inspiring and covered lots of topics in such a short space of time. So thank you so much. We're now open to questions. So continue to use the Q&A function, and participants can also raise their hands. There's a raise hand function at the bottom if you prefer to ask your question verbally. I'll kick us off with a question. There's a question about gender mainstreaming. So I think I'll go to Preet first, but then other panelists, please jump in. What are your views on gender mainstreaming in policy? And has there been any moves to incorporate kind of green or green feminist mainstreaming? I know there's kind of been some work on this, but just be interested to know your views on that, and if kind of Labour is looking into that.
So yeah, I mean, we're nowhere near where the policy formation is. Of course, there's been work that Ed and I have been really doing in terms of, Labour's plans and what some of our concrete actions are going to be. So some of the sort of key areas that Ed and I have really sort of set out are, we've got to really raise the bar on the national climate environmental plans. If we see the ambition, to be honest, it's really, really concerning. And of course, women as part of that recovery are nowhere to be seen in some of those plans. And I think that is so, so important that we challenge where is the role in terms of the recovery of women? Where are women in terms of decision-making in those decision-making areas? But as you said, I mean, how do we absolutely mainstream this? How do we make sure every government department that there's policy coherence going forward, and we look at everything through that gendered lens? And I think that's a real shift And I think it's in our gift to really challenge ourselves, and myself included, as to how we are enabled to do that, so that everything that we are thinking about absolutely looks at what is the impact on women and girls as a result of this, and how do we make our policy and our consultation and interventions much more open and accessible to women. But I think also, we've talked about how we've got to really build that support outside the sort of major players that we normally see, if we really want to create a genuine global movement to tackle the climate crisis. I mean, look, so many women across the global south are actually affected by climate emergency, and these cuts, I think there's a real chance that we're not going to see the success at COP26, because if you don't have 130 developing countries on side to make it credible, they can block agreements. And I think this retreat from the world stage, which of course these cuts are impacting women and girls far, far more. And I talked about how many more women will be pushed into poverty as a result. So it's really taking cognizance of that. But the frustration, of course, is how do we affect change, and how do we actually have a voice? Because we have a government that doesn't really care about these issues. And if we don't mobilize, and if we don't come together, and if we don't create those social movements, if we don't give them voice, then we can't really mainstream a lot of the things that we want to kind of achieve. And I think there's a real challenge there for us, is how do we organize? How do we come together? And what is it that we are bringing to the table that we want to change, really? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Any of the other panelists want to touch on this? Nivon? Sure, Nave?
Yeah, I think gender mainstreaming is important, but I think that particularly when it comes to sort of Green New Deal policies, we need to think about what it actually means. I think when we're trying to rethink what our systems look like, we have a lot of systems in place already. We have systems in the developed world, we have these systems in place. So say, for example, if we're thinking about how we, redo our transport systems to make them greener, we're not going to be creating a new transport system from scratch. Like, we're going to be, anything that we do in the UK, we're going to be retrofitting it onto a system that already exists. And these things are going to happen on the ground. So we've got so for example, rethinking the transport system in Surrey, rural Surrey is going to be completely different to rethinking the transport system in the centre of Birmingham, right? And in order to be able to think about the needs of the women in central Birmingham or in Surrey, we really need to be involving them in thinking about these policies in the first place. And I think gender mainstreaming can sometimes sound a bit sort of abstract and not a tangible thing. And if we're talking about how we're going to rebuild our cities and rebuild our systems in a way that is going to increase gender equality and improve the lives of women, we need to be involving women in the creation of these policies. So I think it's a very difficult thing to gender mainstream in a meaningful way, because it means talking to and listening to women in a genuine way, and not just the sort of, consultation processes that you have at town planning meetings at the moment. It means real co-creation and working with women.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And we have attendee with the hand up. T, do you want to come in?
Hi there. Thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating talk. My question is addressed to both Anne Pettifer and
T, we've lost you.
Oh, hi, hello, sorry. I'm going to stop my video. So my question is addressed to both Anne Pettifer and Preet, as I'd like to get both sides of the coin on this. So there's been a lot of chat about the global south and how important it is to rectify power imbalances. And so I suppose my question is, and this is a wider question of how our economies across the board, global north and south, evolve and develop in the 21st century, given this constraint on resources, the finite resources that we see in the face of global consumerist culture. What does international development look like in the 21st century? I ask this because Anne Pettifer made an excellent point about Malawi and its monetary system and the ways in which CIS countries institutions like the IMF, for example. I can give personal examples with Nigeria, how that's gutted public services in the 70s and 80s and led to mass exodus and migration in the 80s and 90s, which has really affected how the country, sort of the intellectual capital and development within the country as we see it now. How do Western countries then relate in an equitable fashion? Because evidently there's a real tension here between the talk of solidarity, but still holding the power in terms of organizing or promoting particular mandates. And so in terms of heterodox economics as well, I'd really like to hear what Anne Pettifer's take on that, but also from Preet as well. What does that look like for Labour, and how will it not be more of the same?
Thank you, T. That was great. Anne, do you want to come
Yes, no, I could. This is a hobby horse of mine. So thank you for that question, T. It's really a very important one. Can I say this? My views on this are a little controversial, and I speak as someone from the South, actually. I believe that most economies should be as self-sufficient as possible. And what I know about Nigeria is that Nigeria used to be a pretty self-sufficient economy, growing their own food and pretty sustainable until oil came along. And they were persuaded, actually, no, the West wants this and is willing to pay a price for it. And don't worry about growing your own vegetables. You can sell oil and get dollars, and you can buy somebody else's vegetables. Crudely, that was crudely the transformation that took place. So I believe that, all the Western economies evolved by building on three pillars. They fed their people, they housed their people, and they educated their people. And so for me, countries should be freed up to do that. And most African countries, for example, could easily be self-sufficient, could easily grow enough of their own food. Of course, there are some that could not, and could easily build their own houses and even educate their own people. But the whole system has been so distorted that it's made it very difficult for them. And I think Western countries have to become more self-sufficient, and we must stop relying on exploiting the South. If we take it as given that we will grow so far, and then after that, we will just simply go abroad and exploit another country. So, for example, and this is my classic example that I and it's slightly corny, but it's really important, I think we should learn to grow our own green beans. Right now, what we do is we ask Kenya to grow our green beans. We ask her to drain her water table and to exploit her labor force, and then to put our green beans on an aeroplane and fly them to us here 365 days a year. That has to stop. That is not sustainable. So we've got to grow our own green beans. And we in Britain are not used to doing that. And we don't know how to do it. And we don't know how to cope with the winter and agriculture and so on and so forth. But we're going to have to do that if we want a sustainable economy. And then many people say, oh, no, but that's not fair, because Kenya wants to be able to have those exports because that generates income for Kenya. I have to tell you that we all know that generates income for the 1% in Kenya, but not for the rest on the whole. So, and I know that's a controversial area, but I honestly believe that allowing countries to have greater autonomy, to be empowered, if you like, to conduct their economy in the way that they wish to, is democratic and fair. Right now, most poor countries are effectively satellites of rich countries and are there to just provide rich countries with cheap commodities and cheap labor. So I think a green economy, to come back to your question, T, is going to be one that's more self-sufficient, where economies are not going to be oriented towards exports and towards the interests of the West, but instead they're going to be oriented towards the domestic economy and the interests of the people at home. And I've worked in Nigeria, and I know Nigeria quite well, and I can assure you that the government there is not addressing the needs of the people. It's mainly addressing the needs of countries that need Nigeria's very well refined oil. And that's totally unbalanced the Nigerian economy. And as you say, stripped it of both, you know, its fantastic educational system that it had, and therefore of so many of its people, because they've migrated. So yes, for me, self-sufficiency is going to be a fundamental principle of a green economy. Sorry for that long answer, Hannah.
No, thank you very much, Anne. Over to you, Preet.
Thank you so much. And I want to build on some of the stuff that actually I agree with from Anne. For me, it's got to be about a partnership approach. I don't want to have this situation where actually I am imposing my view of what I think are the development priorities for the African Union, for example. People, you know, the government, of course, where there is conflict and we need to help countries transition from good governance to good tax systems, etc. And we can export, you know, really some of the skill sets that we have got and accessibility to do that. But I think we absolutely have got to work with countries as to what is their priorities. And I agree with the point that you made, T, initially, because of course, the conditionality of IMF and World Bank and loans, for example, absolutely restricts so many of the countries across the global south from investing in their own public services. How is that even right? I mean, imagine if we were not able to do that here in the United Kingdom and not able to make sure that people have good education, access to free healthcare. I mean, if anything, the pandemic has shown us that we need a global health strategy, because we can't have a situation that the African Union can't even mass manufacture and distribute vaccines. They've got to rely on other countries, and of course the COVAX facility hasn't really done what it was supposed to have done. So I really want to look at, you know, challenging myself about that relationship, building that relationship, having that trust, and thinking about development from a longer term perspective. I think that's the other thing that I want to see. Is I don't want to look at how we've, you know, I think that it's absolutely, we've got to reform how we've done international development. And of course, a lot of that has gone on humanitarian aid and assistance, and that's absolutely right, given what's going on in the world. But I think I want us to get away from this kind of short-term funding model of development, because actually, if we are really to make the difference and we are helping countries transition, we've got to, understand it will take a long time to get to do that, and to work with governments and civil society, for example, to really make the difference and be able to sort of, and of course, you know, we are being set back in terms of the years that we have made so much progress. But I think also debt, I mean, it's the very first thing. And I know, Anne, Jubilee campaign, you know, you're one of the co-founders, a huge amount of respect. But I think, you know, the G20 have only given a moratorium to most of these countries until the end of the year. But that's really not good enough. We've got to do so much more on debt. And of course, one of the things I'm really clear about is that those countries, especially that are avoiding tax in places like Africa, for example, or tax evasion, whether it's through the UK banking system and territories, we've absolutely got to address that, because that's money that can be reinvested in those countries that is being taken away. And if we look at just across, you know, Britain has got a real huge role in the fact that it's retreated, allowing China and Russia and others to take that space, I think is really, really concerning, because again, what we are seeing is that level of exploitation. So for me, it is about a partnership approach. It is about having trust. It is about focusing on what countries want and how we can support to deliver that. And of course, for me, I really support the public services investment. And I think it's really important that other countries should be able to do the same as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And there's another question. I'll start with Maeve on this, but open to all the panelists about. A lot of you have mentioned the pandemic. Obviously, it's what's on a lot of our minds. But interested to know how and if the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way, if any, that discussions kind of in theory and in policy practice about feminist economics and also the feminist green economy.
Yeah, I think, well, happily, it's the conversations has changed. The policies haven't changed yet. But yeah, certainly for the first time in my political life, care has been front and centre. And it was absolutely incredible to see, people coming out and clapping for carers every week, and people finally seeing that key workers, these essential people that make basically all this social reproductive work that we talk about as feminist political economists, this work that's been invisibilized for ever, always been invisibilized, was being brought to the front, and people were seeing it and responding to it and respecting it and clapping for it. Obviously then that turned into they're not being pay rised, and this hasn't turned into anything in the policy space, but I think in people's consciousness it has changed dramatically. And I think a sort of example of how that has happened is not in the UK but in the US. with the Biden boost, you've got the president of the United States of America saying that trickle-down economics doesn't work, and then investing trillions of dollars in specifically in social infrastructure, which is, I mean, a lot of people will say that it's not enough. A lot of people, green campaigners are saying that the amount he's spending on green stuff is not enough, and then they are right. But the change in conversation is absolutely huge. And we've been living in this orthodoxy of trickle-down economics. This is how economics works. And what the pandemic's done, like Anne says, it's grown a magic money tree. It's got people really realizing what the most important things are. It's got us completely rethinking about what economies are for and what the point of being human is. Like when we're all sat at home on furlough, we had a lot of thinking time, and I've spoken to a lot of people who have fundamentally changed their understanding of how things work. And when you've got, the president of the United States of America confirming it and then putting money where his mouth is, even if it's not enough money, it's a really positive change. And it's sort of mirrored by the potential rise of fascism, but I would like to draw on the positives, and that I think that is a really good thing, and is credit to a lot of the feminist green economists who've been working in this space and putting these ideas forwards for decades.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on the pandemic and how conversations and policy are changing or not changing? Sure, Alice.
I fully agree with Maeve that the pandemic has played a key role in drawing our attention to some of the things that are unpaid. So I think the role of women and the unequal distribution of work at home has been highlighted by the economy, and also the importance of what we value in society and the discrepancy between pay and what we value. And I think it really has raised this question of how are wages determined in the market, and why is it that some people carry out very valuable work, very difficult work, and are paid so much less than others. And I think that that fundamental issue is really on people's mind, and I think there has been no solution or no policy that really then takes that up and puts that into place. But I think everyone has this sense something needs to change. One, because of the climate emergency. It's really very urgent to do something about it. And then also this element of inequality. Inequality has been rising and rising, and there was this rhetoric that it reflects merit. People work hard, they earn a lot. Others don't work hard, they don't earn a lot. I think that is not true to a large extent, and people are aware of it, and we don't really know what to do about it. But I think some of the principles of the feminist green economy really highlight these shortcomings of how we used to think, these shortcuts we had in our minds of how the economy remunerates productivity. And I think as an academic, there's a large research agenda. We really don't know often what is happening. There's a lot more data now available that we see. We can trace wage inequality over time, wealth inequality. We can trace carbon prices. We know costs of these damages from climate change. And so I think pieces are coming together, but also really this sentiment that what we see is not always fair, it's not always just, it's not always reflecting productivity. And there's really an important role for policy to step in and say, well, if we value care work, if we value NHS work, we need to put more money and remunerate people accordingly. And I think some countries, for instance, Scandinavian countries, are doing that much more so, and care workers, teachers are paid much better in other countries. And these countries are not bankrupt because of it. So I think there are different forces at play, and I think just being aware in population of these basic facts, these simple economics that we had in mind, not always explaining what we see, is very useful. And then hopefully we can take it forward towards policies that actually address these inequalities too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, apologies, I've got to get the kids to bed, but I just wanted to say, I mean, it's interesting, during the pandemic, we've seen that domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, not just here in the UK, but across the world, of course, has increased. And yet we've seen the appalling, evidence about the government in terms of rape victims coming forward, and how many prosecutions have had. And it almost feels like we're not outraged enough and we're not angry enough. And I think the challenge there is we've got to ask ourselves why, because it's almost like there's, even in the recovery, there's a two-tier system for recovery for men and women. And, I think, when I talk to a lot of women about the pandemic, it's amazing how many say that they've probably been more busier than they've ever been, because it's not just that they're doing their jobs, they're assuming everything else. And many of them just say that it's expected of them, and that, who else will do it? And it's that kind of attitude, because of course it falls on us. But the question is, when is it going to change? When is it, enough to say enough is enough? And actually, we've got to end violence against women and girls. Why do we not have adverts on our TVs across our cities, educating, our populations, but also demanding that this is just not acceptable and it's not right? And, and it really worries me that it's going to take such a long time. And if it's got so worse under the pandemic, and I've seen it in my own constituency, the increase, the data is just horrific. I worry about how many women are behind closed doors that can't actually access help, because so many services are still not back and they're still not functioning. And it is a really terrifying situation that we are still here. And even as a politician, of course the government's got an 18 majority, but that's not it. But try to galvanize the support of women. Women are tired, they're exhausted. They feel they've got so much on their plates that they just haven't got the energy almost to fight for this. And I think we've got to really think about some of those things that really harm women, that, and the kind of, I know you touched on the care, but actually, where is the GDP investment in care, for example? Where is the policies that will make the difference? Because of course, it's not just about saying we matter, we care, and make some policy commitments here or recognize us. It is actually about a bigger picture around how do we redress the economy. But I think, for me, the biggest worrying thing is just the violence against women and girls, and the abuse. And I think the damage it does to children, who are witnessing that and living in those homes, is going to be yet felt. And I know that's really worrying, but I think it's something that we have to think about, is how do we affect change and really make women feel that absolutely they're not going to take this anymore. Great,
yes, Anne. Oh, Anne, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. So yeah, I want to agree very much with what Peter said. And I've got to say that, it's all very well for say we must do this and we should do that and we must have that. We have to organize, and for that we need trade unions, but also we need a political party. We need political organization. And I think a lot of women find politics distasteful. A lot of women don't find it, alienating. It's very often, we know this. As a member of the Labour Women's Action Committee, we battled for years in the 80s and 90s to feminize the Labour Party, basically, and that's hard. But really what we need is a political party that represents women and does so openly and proudly and assertively, so that women can join the club, can join a movement. And it has to be political. The problem is, as someone who's worked with civil society organizations, it has to be translated into political power. And to have political power means doing more than just belonging to, the RSPB or those very good, charitable based organizations. We need a political organization which will translate our demands into power for women. And that means the Labour Party really has to get its act together, finally.
Thank you so much. This is a great discussion. We have another question from Alexandra, and I think she's going to come in and speak. Yes, great.
Hi, can you hear me all? Sorry for not having video on, but I'm in the middle of dinner, so I do apologise. This has been an incredibly fascinating discussion this evening, but I just wanted to backtrack slightly on the conversation that happened after Tele's question, which is about a sustainable economy. I'm all for the idea and principle of building a sustainable, efficient economy, self-sufficient economy. But what I really wanted to ask is, the farming industry in the UK, for example, has suffered for years. It's almost crippled now as a result of Brexit. There's been a lot of reports recently on the BBC about this. Fishing industry as well has been one of the great losers. So how do we practically build a sustainable Britain, first and foremost, so that we can eventually stop these exports? And how do we do so, and this is really crucial, I think, for Labour, in a sustainable way that doesn't do irreparable damage to some other countries we currently have trade deals with, particularly poorer countries. So that is my question to the panel.
Great, thank you for that question. And Preet, do you want to go answer, or do you have to head off?
Right, I'm going to really just touch on it. I think really important question, but I mean, Labour has actually been calling for a green economic recovery. And I think what we've been saying to the government is it's all very well the government's made these big headlines and the rhetoric, but the detail is not there. And the hypocrisy is absolutely there. You can't sort of make this, we're going to cut emissions, but then you're absolutely not investing in the electric infrastructure. You've got no strategy in terms of retrofitting homes. You're still investing in North Sea oil and gas. You're still, investing in fossil fuel. You're asking other countries to transition to other forms without giving them the climate finance that we needed to enable that. I mean, I think what Labour has been calling for has been really good under Annalise Dodds. It's about bringing forward that 30 billion planned capital investment, creating those green jobs, especially here in the West Midlands. Green jobs in manufacturing, making people understand what green jobs is, because of course we're using terminology that alienates so many people who think, my God, you've got to be middle class or you've got to have a degree to even absolutely access some of these jobs. But 400,000 new jobs can be created. I think the mass unemployment gives us an opportunity actually about how do we create these good, decent jobs which are going to be accessible, in different sectors, especially over the next 18 months. We need that kind of aspiration and hope. There's so many graduates who can't absolutely access jobs. And I just think the hypocrisy, this retreat as the only G7 nation to have cut aid is almost signaling to other richer countries that they can go ahead and do the same. And you need the credibility of the 130 developing countries, as I said, for COP26. And if this government thinks that they won't block agreements and they won't take a stand, well, it's absolutely foolish to think so. And I think the other shocking thing is the great piece that the ITV News did around, on one hand, you'll have COP26 and you've got the Amazon factory down the road with a disposal culture. I mean, absolutely horrifying. How many people have been struggling with laptops? How many of our children have been held back? How can we not support the most poorest here and abroad with the kind of the business model that Amazon has? Absolutely outrageous. But of course, it won't just be Amazon, it'll be so many more. The question is, will the government act? And is it going to be serious in terms of really having the ambition and having that leadership? Well, we'll have to wait and see, because at the moment it doesn't feel like it is.
Thank you. Yes, Anne.
So I wanted to answer Mariana's question as well. And I think what it's about, Mariana, is that, the whole of the global economy has been tilted, has been oriented towards exports. And we've been told that we have to do that. And we have to prioritize, in a sense, the international system over the domestic economy. And that's what countries have done. And the people who've suffered are, are the working people, essentially. The 1% have benefited enormously from the strategy. And we call it globalization. And the Labour Party and the Labour movement and social democracy across Europe have supported globalization. We all think globalization is a good thing because it's the internet and because you can go on exotic foreign holidays and all of that. Actually, globalization is about the internationalization of finance, and to orient your economy towards the international financial system means you've got to generate export revenues. Now, I mean, what I think we should be saying is, sorry, the most important element is our own economy and the people in our economy. So if you look at the rise of Trump has to do with the fact that the people in the Rust Belt who lost their jobs, whose jobs were exported to China, were the ones that voted for Trump, and rightly so, if I may say so, because they were angry. Their interests had been downgraded, and the interests of the big corporations that wanted the cheap labor from China were upgraded. And equally, China hasn't done well out of this. China also has enormous problems with inequality and so on. So I think we have to fall out of love with the thing we call globalization. And I'm in favor of something more like localization, something more like self-sufficiency at home, and international cooperation and coordination. And internationalism, in my view, is a very different thing from globalization. And I want the Labour Party not to be talking about globalization anymore, but be talking about internationalism, about working together with each other, you know, and singing the Internationale, and the left to be thinking about that as well, instead of, so do you see what I'm saying? I think we've got to not accept the way in which the whole of the world economy has been oriented towards the international system. We have to reorient economies back to home and to prioritize the interests of people at home. I mean, that's oversimplifying the story, and of course it's more complicated than that, but that's just to try and answer your question in a few minutes.
Yes,
I'd really like to build on what Anne said, with a really concrete example of how and where this is happening. So yes, there's a whole new thing in local economic development called community wealth building. And the whole idea of community wealth building is about looking at, rather than having these extractivist global or national firms coming into your local area and profiteering from your local area and taking that money away, it's about looking at the wealth that you have in your area and producing and retaining that wealth there. So to give an example, if you've got a care home, for example, that is giving its laundry to, I don't know, Serco or Sodexo or somebody, and they're taking that laundry contract and they're doing the laundry gets done, but the money that's been made from that goes elsewhere. It's about rethinking that and about looking at your local economy and going, right, okay, so this care home is embedded in this community. It can't go anywhere. It's not capital flight out of the area. The care home is embedded in the area and people work in that care home and people depend on it. So that care home can then look at its procurement policies and look at who's in its supply chain and go, right, well, let's use a local laundry instead. So we employ people in that local laundry, and that local laundry, all the people that are in that local laundry spend their money in the local economy. And we can do this at scale, right? We can, and it is happening. It's happening in Preston, it's happening in North Ayrshire, it's happening in north of Tyne, it's happening across the country, and it's happening internationally as well. And it's about thinking about what our money is being used for, and who that money is going to, and what is the point of that money. And if we use our wealth in a way that's inclusive and regenerative, then these changes can be made, and we have a proof of concept. It is working and it's adaptable, and we should be thinking more inclusively and regeneratively than, as Anne rightly says, globalization has led us to do so far.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's been such a great discussion. If no one else has any final questions, I have one final question for all of the panelists. Given the kind of theme of this series about demystifying economics and demystifying economics generally, and also having this themed series on specific areas of economics, I'd like to ask each of you what we can do to encourage more women to pursue careers in economics or even expand their understanding. So I'll go through each of you. Preet had to head off to put her kids to bed, but I'll go through each of you. You could say what we could do would be a really great way to kind of end the session. So Maeve, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, it's a question close to my heart. One of my million jobs at the minute is a campaign to try and increase diversity in economics. And yeah, I think that what we've defined to be economics is automatically a turn-off for women. When we look at individual agents competing in markets, and we don't consider domestic labour or any of the work that women actually do, or anything that reflects the lives of women, and when we actively obscure that work and obscure those experiences, it's, I mean, when I studied economics at university, I had so many female friends who either dropped economics or went into something else, or went into like health economics or other economic areas of economics that they could understand and relate to, and they were basically interested in. So I think first and foremost, we have to change what we're saying economics is. This mainstream economics is to find out any other type of economics that is relevant to the world and relevant to social issues that we care about. And it's all about this abstract theoretical model that when young women go to university and start studying it, they think, right, this isn't about me, it's not for me, so they're turned off. So first thing we have to do is, increase pluralism in economics and teach different economic schools of thought, like feminist economics, like green economics, and so on. So yeah, job one.
Great, thank you, Maeve. And Alice, what do you think?
So my view is that all the issues in economics affect all of us. So I think it's extremely interesting, and I've always found big puzzles in economics and in the world that relate to economics. And so I encourage everyone to find curiosity around them and not be put off by not understanding. I think that's my big motivating factor. So there are many things we don't understand that we cannot solve. And I think that's really a good reason to enter and join and to find it interesting. And I think many of the problems affect all of us, men and women, all sorts of different diversity related aspects, some more, some less, but I think I don't quite agree with Maeve to say that it's hard to see one reflected in discipline as a certain gender. I think there's certain approaches that are more useful to some individuals, some less. And I encourage everyone to kind of own it and find what they think works for them. And for instance, for me, a very important aspect is data and understanding what actually happens by getting enough data to see and check, to not just trust what someone says, to not trust what a model says, but just to make sure you think, you understand. And that is continuously extremely interesting and important to me in doing economics. And I think that can be the same for everyone else. And I don't see there to be any reason why women shouldn't enter it. I think there are certain careers that are very time consuming and take a lot of effort. And I especially encourage women to take these paths. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Alice. And Anne.
So my advice would be this one, that the women and I'm not an agent here for the Financial Times, but I think women should read the Financial Times. Honestly, it's not rocket science, and the things you learn is just extraordinary. This last weekend, I read a story in the Financial Times about super yacht building, a subject in which I have no interest whatsoever. However, I decided to look at it. It turns out that this year, 494 super yachts were built, compared to last year when only 314 super yachts were built. And it takes $500,000 to pay for fueling once, for one fueling of a super yacht, right? So what does that tell you? It tells you, A, that there's a hell of a lot of money out there and it's been wasted on super yachts. Secondly, that these yachts are consuming $500,000 worth of fossil fuels so that, rich people can go prancing around the Mediterranean. And, so when I'm thinking about climate change, I'm thinking, go after those guys. Before you go after anybody else, go after the 1% who can afford to spend $500,000 to fuel one super yacht for one journey, right? So I want you to read the Financial Times and unearth all of these facts and figures and data, as Alice says, and that's going to help you think about and inform you in discussing the economy with. And I tell you, it's really, really very interesting, and it also gets your blood pressure up.
Thank you so much. That was really good, really practical and also kind of inspiring advice. So thank you so much for answering that question, and to all the panelists for the fantastic session today. I learned so much. I'm sure all the attendees learned so much as well. So thank you so much for taking the time. And also want to thank Mariana and Sarah for hosting and organising the bigger series on economics for girls as well. So thank you so much, and thank you so much everyone for coming on a Wednesday that's not on lockdown anymore. So we really appreciate you joining us this evening, and have a great rest of your evening, everyone, and thank you so much.